Hello, everybody. I'm back. It's good to be able to be with you again this day. Thank you to Carolina, who is getting stronger day after day, and she's helping record this video today. Today, I'm going to address the matter of grace, what grace is. And I would probably preface all of this by saying this is my own perspective. It's not by any means something I dreamt up or drummed up. It's something that I've learned from other people, but I've also experienced a great deal myself. And this is an answer to a question posed to me by our own congregant, Ellen Green, concerning grace and how she is taken by a song about grace and wants to know sort of what I think about it. So this may or may not answer her question, but it gives me something to talk about today. So good to be with you. I want to say, first of all, this: grace is not something we do. Grace is what God does. And grace is the activity of God in our lives, in us, through us, for us, and unfortunately, often in spite of us, our own resistances, our own tendencies to turn from God and go our own way, our own lack of faith. Nevertheless, God does not give up on us, and grace continues to work in our lives. I think one of the things that bothers me about present day Christianity in the year 2023 is so much of it is focused on us, as though we are the center of the universe, and the preacher preaches, the church gathers, and everything is about, so now what are we going to do? Or how can we condemn what other people are doing? And so little attention is paid to what God is doing. And that's what grace is all about. So grace is not what we do. Grace is accepting what God is doing in our lives, allowing it to occur, participating in it as God's teammate in God's desire to bring us to God's self and be in relationship with God. So the first thing I want to say about grace is grace strikes us. We don't make grace happen. Grace comes as a surprise. I've learned from neuropsychology. My son is actually a neuropsychologist, and he's head and shoulders more qualified than I am to talk about this. I just read little snippets, articles, a book here or there. I watch some videos about it. And one of the things that has struck me, and I hope I get this right, is that we have a sensation. And then within a split second, the sensation turns into a thought. And we have a consciousness of what is going on in us. But there's this delay between our awareness of what's going on in us and when something strikes us, a sensation or whatever. And I would say that grace strikes us, and it comes to us by surprise. We don't know where it comes from, but once it hits us, then we start to formulate in our own mind what's going on. So some of the people say, the people who don't believe in God say, all of this stuff just simply comes from our own biology. We get this sensation, a neuron neurons in our brain fire up, and we then make sense of it with another part of our brain. And all of this is physical. Others would say, no, we can't pinpoint exactly how and where the original sensation comes from, but it comes from some place beyond us, and it comes into us and through us. And that's what I think I would like to talk about today, is that grace comes to us from beyond us. It's not something we dream up. It strikes us. And when it does, we then formulate it and say, wow, something really remarkable has happened. One of the things they talk about in the Bible is the grace of ministry. The grace of ministry is something that came to me. It's not something I sat down for days on end and thinking, so what am I going to do? And I write down a list of pros and cons and reasons why I should be a pastor one day. What happened was something struck me from out of nowhere. I was in this kind of existential despair. What am I going to do with my life? What is my life all about? And something struck me, and it was like a light went off. And instantaneously, shortly thereafter, after that initial impulse, that initial being struck, I said, I have to be a pastor. And one thing led to another, and grace, God did what God was going to do through grace, and things fell into place for me and my family. And now, all these 30 some years later, this is what I'm doing. People say, when did you decide to be a pastor? I said, no, I was struck. And then from that original strike, I then had this understanding, this is what I'm supposed to do. I'm influenced a great deal on this by a theologian named Paul Tillich, who lived last century, who was a Lutheran theologian, chased out of Germany by the Hitler regime, came to America and taught theology at places such as Harvard and also University of Chicago, Union Theological Seminary. And he used to come every once in a while to their chapel services at the seminaries and deliver a sermon. And he delivered one on grace. Where sin abounds, there does grace abound all the more. Grace always overcomes something. Grace is a power beyond us that overcomes us and overcomes all the things in our lives, in ourselves, that resist grace and resist the blessing and the work of God in us. And so he says, grace is something that overcomes us. It strikes us. It occurs in spite of us. It's not something we earn. It comes sort of like a bolt out of the blue, and it strikes us. And it returns us to God. Grace is this message to us that comes to us from beyond. It strikes us by surprise. We are overwhelmed, overcome by it. And then the Holy Spirit starts to do the work, saying, this is what's going on. He wrote the sermon called You Are Accepted, based on this matter of grace, from 1946. And he says this, do we know what it means to be struck by grace? He went on to say, Tillich did, that grace strikes us when we are in great pain or restlessness. It strikes us when we are walking through the dark valley of a meaningless and empty life. Grace strikes us in those moments when we feel our separation from God, others, and ourselves more deeply than usual. And it returns us to ourselves and to them. Grace strikes us in those moments when we are disgusted with our own being, our indifference, our weakness, our hostility, our lack of direction. Grace strikes us when the perfection we long for in our lives fails to appear, when we realize that all our old compulsions continue to reign in us as they have for decades. Sometimes in that moment, a wave of light breaks into our darkness. And it is as though a voice were saying, you are accepted. You are accepted. Accepted by that which is greater than you, and the name of which you do not yet know. Do not ask for the name now. Perhaps you will find it later. Do not try to do anything now. Perhaps you will do something later. Do not seek for anything. Do not perform anything. Do not intend anything. Simply accept the fact that you are accepted. It strikes them. Tillich himself had a certain reputation for philandering and other things, and probably was disgusted at himself, at his conduct, at the ways that he was separating from God and from other people. And he felt this enormous burden and weight of guilt. And one night when he was preparing that sermon, he wrote those words, and he did it in his own hand, back in the day when we used pen and paper. And in the margin of that paper, it said, this is for me. It's not just something he was going to tell other people. It says that in that moment, he was struck by grace, that he is accepted in spite of himself, in spite of what he has done. This is an overcoming power that's greater than us. He does not drum up the strength to face his guilt and overlook it. No, it's a voice that comes from beyond, out of who knows where, before he's even aware of it. It strikes him. And grace is this wonderful thing. It struck me when I knew I had to go into ministry. And now, all these years later, I can look back and say, it wasn't me. I didn't formulate this. I didn't create this. It struck me, and the grace continues to go on. And so, grace is, once again, it is God at work in you. And I don't know if this particular video will stimulate you to be attentive to that voice that will strike you before you even know it has struck you and says, in spite of yourself, you are accepted. In spite of your shortcomings, the work of God is active in you. Allow it to occur. Work with it. It is grace. It is from beyond you. And the wonderful thing about grace is, once you experience it like that, when you revisit it, it brings up all of these wonderful recollections of that initial jolt when grace struck you for the first time. And grace will strike you and strike you anew. And so when people are excited about grace and they want to hear about what God is doing in other people's lives, it stirs up in them memories of the time that they were struck by grace. And that's one of the things that we could do in the church, rather than sitting around saying, well, why aren't you doing more of this? And why isn't more of this happening in the world? The question is, what's happening in you? And it is the work of God in you. It is grace that strikes you. And maybe it'll strike you in this. If grace struck me, the grace of ministry and the grace of the salvation of God, grace can strike you as well if you have ears to hear and a heart that's open. Tillich says further about faith. Faith is being grasped. Faith is the experience of a finite, limited being grasped by the infinite and all-powerful. Faith is not even something you do. Faith is the experience of being grasped by something greater than you. It's that grace. Faith is your response to God, active in your life, striking you by surprise. There is no thing that you have done that grace cannot overcome, but it has to strike you and you have to receive it. I'm sure people over the centuries and millennia have discounted or dismissed that instant of being struck. And in their pride and in their foolishness, they say, oh, there's nothing wrong with me. Or to the contrary, they may say, there's everything wrong with me. There's no way grace can do anything with me. No, it is receiving that and being grasped by it. And is that experience of faith. And so one of the things that I would encourage you to do is, first of all, open the heart, the eyes of your heart, to see and to hear and to be struck. And when it does, to receive it and work with it. And it does wonderful things in your life and for you. It is grace. And talk about it. There is just great joy in hearing about how grace has struck another person. And we don't talk about that enough. We want to talk about everything else, our budgets, our building here in this church. But we need to talk about having been struck by God in spite of us. It is the thing that stirs us. And we want to keep singing about it, like I'm sure Ellen does, wants to hear that song about grace. In spite of her, in spite of all she's been through, the grace of God is active in her, and she wants to share it. Thank you, Ellen, for doing that. And I hope in some way I've said that to you today. And I pray by the grace of God that somehow you are struck this week, and grace will strike you, and accept it, and accept that you are acceptable, even though you think of yourself as unacceptable. So good to be with you this week. See you again sometime soon. Bye now.